It is a pleasure and a privilege for me to share part of the Centennial sessions with you this morning. As we were singing, and I was up here right on this side, and I got to really enjoy the brass section, and it brought back memories from me. Yeah, a shout out. Saulo, Jono, and I don't know the name of the trumpeter. It took me back to growing up as a missionary kid in Germany, listening to maybe unmissionary kid-like music, especially the music of Chicago. And that was just, I was right there. You were taking me back. That was great. Real treat to have that as part of this morning. Before I start this morning, I want to put the lie to a rather nasty rumor that Phil Callaway began. First of all, okay, let's just get that up there. Apparently, he did say, so I heard, that he fired me as his sign man. And that is patently not true. Like the hair that once occupied the top of his now shiny pate, I told Phil, "You can't fire me, I quit." But we are in negotiation. And there might be some reconciliation by the time that this evening rolls around. We'll see. No, I've had great fun with Phil over the years, and he's included me in some of his trips. It's always a delight to share time together with him, whether it's on this, on a podium like this or elsewhere. Well, the topic that Mark asked me to speak on this morning was that of living in the light, or that theme, that aspect of Sukkot that talks about the importance of light, or the theme of light. Not only just in the Feast of Sukkot, but what that means for us. And I want to relate it to the mission of Prairie College towards the end of our time this morning. Well, light, as you know, and this is just a bit of a refresher. You're probably, if you've been here for all the sessions, you're hearing something that has been gone over time again. But we'll just do a refresher and bring up to speed those who may have just arrived yesterday evening or this morning. Light is a central element of the Feast of Sukkot. Just as water is vital to sustaining life, so is light. And it's no accident that these two symbols were central to Israel's covenant gathering here at the Feast of Tabernacles each year. Light, especially torchlight at night, was the way God's presence was evident among his people in their deliverance from slavery in Egypt. That pillar of fire by day, pillar of fire by night, cloud by day. The symbol not only pointed back to God's role as a deliverer in salvation history, but also a prophetic role that anticipated a Messiah deliverer that we ultimately find in Jesus. And I went on, I used some of the material that Justin used and referred to yesterday, some of the Mishnah material that describes the Feast of Sukkot. I also went to a website called Jewish Roots that describe a little bit some of the activities that were part of that. So, an image here. During the Feast of Tabernacles, there was a great ceremony called the illumination of the temple, which involved the ritual lighting of 4 golden oil-fed lamps in the court of women. These lamps were huge menorahs or candelabras. They stood some 75 feet high on these elevated poles. They lighted the temple at night to remind people of the pillar of fire that had guided Israel in their wilderness journey. And there were 4 ladders that ran up each pole, and young priests in training, young kids, were assigned the task. Each was assigned one of these ladders, and they would climb up these ladders. Clearly, not being afraid of heights was a qualification for the priesthood, because I can't imagine doing this. Climbing up these 75-foot poles to the top, they would carry pitchers of oil that had as wicks the old material from the trousers of worn-out priestly garments that acted as wicks, and they would light the candles each evening. And all night long, the light shone its brilliance, and it is said it illuminated the entire city. In celebration and anticipation of the holiest of Israel's men danced, sang psalms of joy and praise to the Lord. There was a band, just like we heard here, made up of percussion instruments, horns, stringed instruments that would play on the steps of the temple. People would dance. The festival was a reminder that God had promised to send a light, the light to a sin-darkened world. God had promised the Messiah to renew Israel's glory and release them from bondage and restore their joy. So imagine that you would be in ancient Jerusalem during the Feast of Tabernacles. And maybe this is the view that it could have looked like, say, looking across the valley from the Mount of Olives. You see the entire city lit up. And visualize these massive menorahs giving this tremendous amount of light, and the impact of Jesus' words in the temple courtyard when he announces, "I am the light of the world." To say the least, that would have been a spectacular sight. And it gives Jesus' words centuries later a new visceral and theological potency. To make such a claim against the backdrop of a spectacular light show in the temple was to leave no doubt as to what he meant in making such a claim. No longer were those in Jerusalem for that particular Sukkot celebrating a prophetic hope of the future. Jesus makes it clear that celebration was in order because the hope of deliverance was now a present reality in his person. How provocative was that? No wonder the responses were so extreme. Those who were believing were going, yes, this is it. This is the moment. Even if that deliverance they visualized was somewhat different or was going to look very different from what they expected. And those who thought, how can some backwoods teacher, some rabbi from Galilee, like I said, can anything good come out of Galilee, have the nerve to claim that? No wonder they wanted to kill him. So let's just pause at this point to consider the theme of light throughout the Bible. We're going to do a very hasty sort of thematic flyover, both in the Old Testament and then in the New Testament. And you see where we're going here. And like a good preacher, I've got alliterated points. And we're going to walk in the light, we're going to worship in the light, and then we're going to rest in the light. The W is silent, just so that you know that. And I've got one more that has actually a W, but I'm going to save that for the next slide. So please bear with me. Here we go. Let's just put this statement of Jesus into the larger context of the covenant story of Israel's redemption from slavery, their call as a chosen people, and then how that was to expand into a global story of salvation. Let's go back to the beginning. Genesis 1. The first words we hear God speak are, "Let there be light." It is the first divine word, the first speech act of creation, of bringing cosmic order out of the chaos and darkness of the formless void. And this is just a little sidebar here. I did some, because I teach a course in the history and philosophy of science, and light as a scientific phenomenon of nature is fascinating, and we are only beginning to sort of get into or scratch the surface of the mystery of light. Michael Denton, scientist, in his work, Children of Light, talks about some of the properties, the unique properties of light, and not just light itself, but how we are uniquely made as creatures of God to be able to perceive light so that it can be of use to us in our world. Light is the universal constant in the cosmos. Everything else adjusts to the speed of light. Space, matter, time. As objects approach the speed of light, they become contracted. Matter undergoes contraction. Time undergoes dilation. Everything is relative to that constant. So it's really appropriate that light as a metaphor for who God is and as the first act of creation is the constant, the ground zero, if you will. And I want to draw our attention to the functions of light, this primal entity of creation, that are going to be crucial to Israel's understanding of their Creator, their Redeemer, and their covenant giver. That light has a spiritual quality about it for people was never in doubt. We know this from the earliest records, whether it's Israel, but even parallel records contemporary to Israel or even before. We know this from other religions in Israel's history. The key difference between Israel's understanding of light and those of rival religions, and this is one of the important things, I believe, about Genesis 1, is that God is making clear that He is the source. He is the creator of light, and the luminous bodies that people would have seen as they looked up into the heavens, the sun, the moon, the stars, they are not divine, or they are not even intermediaries of divinity, but they are merely created bodies, and that He alone is the creator and ultimate source of light. The Feast of Sukkot included light as a central part of its celebration because God, as the light of creation, was also the light of Israel, His covenant people. And there were numerous reasons for Israel to celebrate that feast. I want to point out just a few of them. One of the most obvious functions of light is that it illuminates. And you go, well, duh. Well, yes, but it is profound. It penetrates what is otherwise obscured in darkness. We have, at night here, we have so much what we might call light pollution from electricity. We can't really appreciate how dark darkness is when there is no light absent. Those of you who have lived in countries where electricity is intermittent at best and probably absent at night at worst, you understand that. You can talk about a darkness you can actually feel. It's so thick. And so light that illumines is not taken for granted. It makes clear what's going on around us and serves to guide people's paths. And this is how God acted in the life of His people. We see this in Exodus 13, God's presence in Israel as a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. It was right over the tabernacle. When the cloud moved, Israel moved. This light was the Shekinah glory that illumined and led Israel out of slavery through their wilderness sojourn. Elsewhere, though, in the Old Testament, Job 29, he offers this same insight when he describes God as watching over him so that by His light he could walk through darkness. The Psalms, probably one of the richest books with this light metaphor. They make reference to this aspect of God as illuminating and guiding light as well. Psalm 89, blessed are those who have learned to acclaim You, who walk in the light of Your presence. One of the best known verses in Psalms, if you went to Sunday school, you probably had to memorize it, just like I did, Psalm 119, 105, where the psalmist proclaims, Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. And in the time of exile, it is the prophet Isaiah who issues the invitation for wayward Israel to return to the Lord. Come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. So the celebration of Sukkot was one of gratitude for God's guiding presence and freeing Israel from the darkness of slavery, enabling Israel to walk in the light. A second function of light is that it provides warmth. It makes things grow. The sun was the chief metaphor and the obvious reference for this manifestation of the God of light. Like the sun, God was the source of life, of blessing, and abundance. And therefore, the response of Israel was to be one of joyful worship in the light. We see this in Psalm 4, where David writes, let the light of Your face shine upon us. Fill my heart with joy as when new wine and grain abound. Light, joy, the bringing forth of abundance. are all brought together. In Psalm 43, the poet writes, "Send me your light and your faithful care. Let them lead me. Then I will go to the altar of God, my joy and my delight." The light of God is the source of life to his people, and therefore an invitation to draw near in worship and praise. The prophet Isaiah in chapter 9 gives us another picture of this same relationship of light and the response of joyful worship. He writes, "The people of God, the people who walked in darkness, have seen a great light, and on those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. You have enlarged the nation and increased their joy. They rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, and warriors rejoice when dividing the plunder." And later on, the prophet Isaiah provides one of the most rousing anthem-like passages on this theme in chapter 60. "Arise, shine, your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over the peoples. But the Lord rises upon you, and his glory appears over you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn." That's just spectacular. This God who is light is worthy of our worship. And to know God as light, therefore, is to rejoice in his life-giving faithfulness, to bow down in worship before him, in awe, in reverence. And so the festival of Sukkot celebrates God who invites us to walk in the light as his guiding light, to also worship his life-giving light. And a third theme related to God as light, closely related to the first two, but I believe it's worth splitting out and mentioning on its own, and that is resting in the light. And like I said, W is silent, but it's there. The metaphor of light is associated with rest and restoration, of shalom, of wholeness, a sense of finally having arrived at home, sort of where we were always supposed to be. And as I was thinking about this the other day, a picture of this came to mind from the experience that my colleague, our Old Testament professor, Megan Roberts, was telling me about. She was journeying back from her home in Denver, and right about Great Falls, her car started giving her some trouble, and the heating gauge was showing that it was vastly overheating. She managed to get a tow truck to get her into Great Falls. Mark and Elaine's daughter and son-in-law put her up overnight. They got it fixed. She was on her way the next day. And just as she was telling me later, just as she pulled in to Three Hills, once again, her temperature gauge on her car just went from normal right to overheating. And she said, "But I made it. I was in Three Hills. I was there. I was home. I could breathe a sigh of relief. I was where I belonged." And that sense of relief, of coming home, I think is what God's light gives his people. It provides security, satisfaction. It provides salvation and completeness. Shalom. In Psalm 27, David describes this when he writes, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" Man, I got that mosquito. If any of you, if I'm doing some weird choreography up here, it's not because I'm having a charismatic experience or anything like that. It's just, that the mosquitoes are kind of, and so I may see the same thing happening out there, but it's just, it's part of the fun. Again, in Psalm 36, David brings together light as a source of restoration and rest, salvation and security, when he writes, "How precious is your unfailing love to those who take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast in the abundance of your house, and you give them to drink in the river of your delights. For with you is a fountain of light. In your light we see light." That's got to be one of the best lines in all of Scripture. Light that gives peace, light that gives security, light that gives a vantage point of abundance and satisfaction, light that lets us know in some way we were made for this. The prophet Isaiah uses light as the culmination of God's redemptive work, which will provide the ultimate rest for his people. Near the end of chapter 60, he writes, "The sun will no more be your light by day, nor the brightness of the moon, For the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your God will be your glory. Your sun will never set again, and your moon will wane no more. The Lord will be your everlasting light, and your days of sorrow will end. What a great picture of the God who is light, who gives healing and wholeness. And thus, we are to respond by resting in that light. And so that is certainly worth celebrating. Now, so far we've looked at God as light in the Old Testament. I just want to, in very quick fashion, talk about how the New Testament sees these same themes but applies them to Jesus. Jesus himself, of course, does that. And my mind goes right to the opening verses of John, because John is the evangelist of Jesus as the light. The first 18 verses, the Logos hymn, which is really a recasting of Genesis 1, that is now the creation account fulfilled in Jesus. Now the divine creator becomes the new speech act of a new creation. The God who in Christ spoke creation into being now enters his creation at the ground as the ground zero of that creation. And just as light was primal in the first creation, now Jesus, as the new light, is going to be primal to the new creation. He is the firstborn, the Word that becomes flesh and dwells and tabernacles like the Shekinah glory among his people. John writes, "In him was life, and the life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome or has not comprehended it." The translation of that word can go either way, and I think that might be on purpose, that there is a deliberate ambiguity here that is intentional. Yes, it cannot be overcome, but it can also maybe not be comprehended. And it sounds both triumphant and ominous at the same time. In the verses that follow, this hymn of praise just turns heart-rendingly tragic. There's a shift from praise to pathos. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made by him, the world did not recognize him. But sadness and tragedy do not have the last word. There comes a glimmer of hope. And like that great Canadian theologian Leonard Cohen said, there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So sadness and tragedy don't have the last word. There comes a glimmer of hope, and that's what we see next in John's hymn. Yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Amen? If Jesus is the primal light who will reprise Genesis 1, we also see him as claiming to be that same light in the Old Testament that writers spoke throughout their writings. And as I mentioned at the outset, John 8:12 is likely at the very feast of Sukkot. Jesus makes this bold claim: "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but have the light of life." And so can we imagine being in the temple in a late afternoon when the menorah cauldrons are being elevated and then lit, and then hearing these words? No wonder people took offense. Here is God's invitation through his Son once again to walk in the light, to bask in the life-giving glow of that light. And for John, this theme comes up time and time again. Jesus invites his followers to walk in the light in John 12. In his first epistle, in his opening chapter, he invites them to fellowship or worship in the light. It is the basis for communion with God and with each other. And in the book of Revelation, John gives us a picture of all of creation finally resting in the light of Jesus. There will be no more night, he writes. They will not need the light of a lamp or the light of the sun, for the Lord God will give them light, and they will reign forever and ever. That is the culmination of God as light. So now, here's the amazing thing. John takes us from Jesus in his earthly ministry and his claim to be the fulfillment of all that Sukkot celebrated, and he points it towards the end of history, when Jesus is the light over a creation that is fully restored and fully at rest. And therefore, Sukkot celebrates a past history, a present reality, and it is already anticipating a prophetic or a culmination that is yet to come. It's not And that culmination, that rest, is not a cessation of activity, but now a state where creation is designed to do what it was always intended to do. So what are we as children of light to do as we live between the times, between Jesus' pronouncement and his return? We are, as the Apostle Paul says, to live as children of light. That's Ephesians 5:8. Another way of putting this is to bear witness to the light. There's my other W, and that's a true one. In Matthew 5:14-18, Jesus speaks to his disciples and tells them, as his followers, that they are the light of the world, a city set on a hill that cannot be hidden. Therefore, let your light so shine before others that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Walk in the light, worship in the light, rest in the light, and thus bear witness to the light. And that's what we're celebrating here this week. Prairie can participate and share in the Feast of Sukkot because for 100 years, we thus far, and hopefully maybe another 100 to come, should the Lord tarry, we, like the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 4:6, are called or are charged to bear witness to God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," and who has made his light shine in our hearts to give us the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. Our earliest motto proclaimed to know Christ and to make him known. And as a kind of image, I went back to pop culture again. And I'm waiting for this thing. And those of you will look at that and go, okay, that's Pink Floyd. Not exactly standard music, the famous album cover at the time. Not exactly standard listening music at Prairie. But as I looked at it, it made a lot of sense as a theological image. We see God as light that penetrates the darkness and hits us. We are prisms. And as it passes through us, we are imperfect. The light refracts. It doesn't stay purely white because we are not perfect images. We are not thoroughly transparent. But the wonder of it is that as light passes through us and then out to those around us, it breaks into the whole color spectrum. And that too represents God's glory coming through imperfect, refracted images. And I know the rainbow is a vexed sign these days, but you know what? We're taking back what's ours. God gave that to us, and we should use it faithfully and proudly. So therefore, I just think of that as God doing his work through imperfect images, and yet his light is there for us. You know, I was privileged to be both a beneficiary and a participant in that 100-year legacy, that Prairie shining forth and bearing witness to the light. My parents, Corny and Kay Enns, attended Prairie in the 40s. They were on staff in the 50s. My dad was a member of a gospel quartet that traveled with Ellie Maxwell on many of his preaching tours throughout North America during the first half of the 50s decade. That same quartet became known as the Jans Quartet. 3 other members were being brothers by that name. My dad was the minority Enns report. And after an exploratory ministry in 1953 to Germany, in 1961, the quartet was reunited there as a mission organization carrying out large-scale evangelism through Europe, bringing the light of the gospel to people who had been shattered in so many ways by the false light of Hitler's regime of Nazism that used light. I mean, Hitler and the Nazis and Albert Speer understood the power of light. Here we see the great Cathedral of Light at one of the Nazi rallies at the square at the Zeppelin field in Nuremberg. And yet, that light was exposed as idolatrous and false and destructive. And later on, the Jans Quartet with their pianist Harding Broughton, also an alum, who is still the only one living of that group. It's too bad he couldn't make it here. They were filling some of the largest auditoria in Germany with people who were hungry for the gospel in the wake of the destruction of World War II. So my parents were some of the many Prairie grads who heard the call of God while studying here to serve him in needy and dark places outside North America. At the same time, Prairie drew Christians from outside North America to come and study here and then be witnesses to the light of the gospel in needy places right here in our own land. And so the traffic worked both ways. And I came across some of these remarkable stories again when reading Margaret Epps' Into All the World. And that's how I came across the story of Noriko Suzuki. And I have two alums that I'm going to call up here in just a little bit, and I want you to hear their stories in brief, but knowing that their stories could be and have been articulated and repeated in various theme and variation throughout the conversations here. But I thought it would be great as sort of a crowning point of this presentation to hear about what it has meant for two of Prairie's grads to bear witness to the light. And so I'm going to call my cousin up, Bob Jantz. He's the son of one of the quartet members, Adolf Jantz, who served with the Jantz team many years in Germany. And I'm also going to call up Noriko Suzuki, who came to Prairie from Japan and then went on to work with NCEM, the Northern Canadian Evangelical Mission. And I've given them 3 questions. And so they're the questions that I'm going to use to interview them. And you're just going to hear a small sampling of how God used Prairie graduates and continues to use Prairie graduates to bear witness to the light. So, Noriko, Bob, come ahead. Join me. Right here. Oh, Andrew, thank you. Bob, I'm going to have you move over one because I want to sit between you. Because it's my presentation and I'm still the star of this show. You're such a good sport. Okay, Noriko, I'm gonna begin with you. I want you to briefly tell us when you were at PBI and what was it that brought you here to school in the first place.
I was in PBI 68 to 72, and I was doing a devotion at bedtime. Philippians 1:21 came to my heart. For to me to live is Christ, to die is gain. And I thought I gave my life to the Lord. And I went to see the pastor, where Bible school I better go to study the Word of God. He said, go overseas. And eventually, my hometown in Yokosuka, Japan, there's a PBI graduate, Chiyoko Sekihara. She came to Japan with GEM, Japan Evangelical Mission, which is used to have headquarters here on campus 3 Hills. And quite few PBI graduates came too with GEM. And Chiyoko studied at the Prairie Bible Institute. She was born in the States and raised in the States, came to Prairie, and went to Japan as a missionary with GEM, Japan Evangelical Mission, which is usually ministering west coast of Japan. And then she married to the professor of the Christian college of my hometown, and she attended my church. She urged me to go to Prairie to hear Mr. Maxwell. And she said, he's getting old, so you better die quick. So that is my eager is to hear Mr. Maxwell to take his course. And but freshman I couldn't take his class, and second year I couldn't take his class. Junior year I took his class, Law and Grace. Yeah, yeah.
So we've got you at Prairie, so I just want to follow up with the second question then. Was there a particular moment that you can recall or something in your time at PBI where you sensed a call to serve as a missionary, and particularly as a missionary to the First Nations people of this country rather than going back home?
Yes, definitely, precisely. When one morning in the chapel hour, Phil Howard came. That is he was at that time director of the NCM, Northern Canada Evangelical Mission. Even I think he was the brother of Elizabeth Elliot, I think. Yeah, and he challenged us, students from Orient. We have difficulty to reach our indigenous people. Why not people from Asia, Orient, might be more easy access? That is a challenge. Yeah.
As I was reading the NCEM history off their website after I discovered your story in Margaret Epps' book, I think, as I recall, Phil Howard said something that would be in this day and age very politically incorrect to urge. He says, well, you're Asian, you look a whole lot more like them than we do.
Yeah. And exactly so, especially among Inuit people. They forgot I'm Japanese. They thought I'm Inuk. So, yeah, we are same. We are ancestors the same, I think.
Okay, I'm just going to hit the pause button here, Narika. I'm going to turn over to Bob. And I want you to tell a little bit about how you came to be at PBI.
Well, I came to PBI in 1947. I didn't graduate then. That's when we arrived here. I was in grade 3, and that's how I came to Prairie. My parents moved here with the rest of the Jance Quartet members, and so I know what grade school was like here. I know what high school was like here, and I know what Bible school was like here. I went all the way through, spent 14 years of my life here, and I would say if there's any place that's home to me, it's here at the Prairie, here in Three Hills. So I'm very happy to be here once again. We came extra just to kind of be here for this centennial.
Just for this interview.
Story. For this interview,
yes.
Right.
Okay, so you were at Prairie, like you say, in different stages, formative stages of your life. Can you recall, through all those years here, a specific time or a specific event in your life at Prairie when you sensed a call to missionary service?
Well, I sat in the Prairie Tabernacle. I was in that first Prairie Tabernacle. I remember that one too. But sat in here, and I heard L.E. Maxwell preach for 14 years. And sometimes, as a teenager, I thought he preached a little too long. He would start preaching, and he had his sermon, and he would get to a point, maybe point 1, and then he'd say, well, I'll continue next week. He could extend his sermons pretty good. But yeah, I'll tell you, Mr. Maxwell's messages touched me even as a child and as a teenager. And then, of course, I studied here in the Bible school, and those 4 years here at Prairie were very special for me. I somehow, high school, I kind of lived under the law. But when I got to the Bible school, I personally started living under grace. Stretched a few things, but I felt freer. High school was not that free for me somehow. And maybe some of you who were in high school know that too. But, the thing that really impressed me were these big missionary conferences that we used to have here. I mean, the tabernacle was right here where we're sitting. And we didn't have 800 people come to those conferences. That tabernacle, I think there were 3,500, 4,000 people packed into that place on those special weeks that we had at the beginning of the school year and at the end of the school year. And I mean, hey, we had, Alan Redpath, Stephen Alford, Ian Thomas, Jim Voss. I mean, L.E. Maxwell brought the cream of the crop here for these conferences. And I sat there and heard these messages, and then the missionaries that came. I mean, some of those stories they told us just impressed me. And so I would say it was Ellie Maxwell's preaching and these missionary conferences that really, impressed me, and we ended up being missionaries ourselves.
So between the two of you, Bob, what I'm hearing here is what God accomplished in one chapel in Noriko's life. It took about 14 years and multiple chapels and conferences to come about.
It took a long time
you were
for God
clearly
to come
in a
through,
slower
yeah.
group. So, but God does
I'll
not
accept
give
that.
up easily. Okay, you're such a good sport. Okay, brings us to our third question. I'm going to come back to Noriko here. So from your time as a missionary, and I know and we talked about this, and this is forcing you to make a very difficult editorial choice because you have so much to draw on where you've seen God at work in your ministry. But can you give us one example that particularly illustrates the power of the gospel as Jesus as the light of the world that you saw transforming lives?
I tried to make it shorter. Just I joined the mission in 1977 NCM, and they sent me to the Fort George, east coast of James Bay, Cree Village, and I was there only 2 years because when I had co-workers and trappers, their name from Cree family, same age as me, and 7 children came out with me together. And as soon as we went there was opposition. They didn't want us. And so only I was able to do as a Sunday school. Children came, usually 20 to 30 kids came, in spite of their parents against them coming. Don't go there, she will steal your soul. But they came. And then after 2 years, village band council asked us leave for good. We call you when we need you. And then, so we just had shook the dust of our feet. That's obviously the deal. And then the Lord led me to the Inuit ministry further north, way up north. But 29 years later, I was visiting Japanese churches who being faithfully supporting me in my work. All my support, 100% from Japan, Japanese churches from Japan. Wow. And then, amazing, that's from God. And the email came, one of the former students. My name is Pauline. Hello from the former Fort George Sunday School student. My name is Pauline, and I'm now 38 years old, mother of 5 children. The reason I'm writing you, I was attending your Sunday school you hold in Fort George. Oh. And then, if you come visit us, you will see born-again kids among Sunday school. So that is next following day, 30 years later, June, I visited there for 3 weeks. And 6 former kids, they are all grown up, 38, 39, 40. They came, we hold 3 weeks. Revival ministry for Fort George Sunday School. And I was staying there for 3 weeks. In goose hunting season, I ate goose meat almost every day. I feel like I'm flying over there. and then I was staying at Linda's as a student. And she told me, when I was born again, I could understand. I understood well, but you taught us. I was taught. Wow. And Linda's husband got saved. Parents got saved. And her brother got saved. His wife got saved. When I left Fort George after 30 years, and her parents came to see me off to the airport.
Oh, man.
Thank you.
Cool.
Okay.
Oh, that is so special. Thanks, Noriko. Truly, truly amazing. Bob, Tell us about one example where, of the many during your ministry in Germany, where you saw the transformative work of Jesus bringing light to a darkened world.
Well, a time comes to my mind. This was quite early on in our time in Germany. It was 1971, I think. And my cousin Larry Jantz and I we traveled together, and we were a team. We were called the Jantz Team Ambassadors, ministering and having evangelistic events in different parts of the country. And we got an invitation from 4 Lutheran State Church pastors to come and have a series of meetings in their church. And that only happened once. That was this time. We didn't usually get invitations from those kind of men, but we did in this case, and it was amazing. They invited us, and they told us, "We want you to do the way your evangelism the way you always do it. We know that theologically we don't kind of agree with each other, but that's okay. We want you to preach the gospel. We want you to sing. We want you to do the preparation meetings like you always do." And that was unbelievable. So we did it. And I think, I was a little naive, but God in his mercy, somehow the Holy Spirit helped us to be able to say things in a way that did not turn people away, but rather brought people to Christ. It was amazing that we did counselor training in these churches. There were 4 of these churches in the southern part of Hamburg in a place called Violande. There were these 4 beautiful, kind of like museum-type churches in which we were in. And so I had my first series it was a weekend of preparation meetings, and I thought maybe a few people would turn out. 40 people turned up. And so I told them how they, could lead a person to Christ. And I realized that the people that were sitting there, probably, I don't know, maybe there were 2 or 3 that were really believers. Otherwise, none of them were. And they didn't partly understand what I was saying.
They would have just been baptized and confirmed.
They would have been baptized and confirmed, yeah. Right. But they didn't know anything about the gospel, really. But I have to cut it short. The amazing thing is they invited us for a week of meetings, and we were in the 4 churches, 2 nights in each church. And, who comes to church in a midweek service? These people came. The churches were full, and we preached the gospel. And Larry and I would stay up nights sometimes till 1 a.m. leading people to Christ. It was amazing. And we met every morning with the pastors. And one morning, as we were talking with each other, one of the pastors says, "Well, what do you and Larry tell these people when you talk to them after the service?" And my cousin Larry said, "Well, do you really want to know?" I said, "Yeah." So Larry shares the gospel with these pastors. And he had the courage to say, says, I don't know, maybe you want to pray this prayer. And one of the oldest pastor there said, "I want to pray that prayer." And I believe that man came to Christ that day. God did amazing things. It felt like, I don't know what it felt like when God moved in Jerusalem back there in the early church, but that kind of a feeling was there. And the result, we have people, that so many accepted Christ, and they preached the gospel in that church. They started their own little group. They invited the pastors to come and have Bible studies with them. And more and more people came to Christ through those who initially came to Christ back in those. We were invited back. I don't know how many times we were invited back to do the same thing over again in those churches. That was unbelievable for us.
Praise God. Well, Noriko and Bob, thank you both. Thanks for taking the time and the willingness to come up here and share a little bit. I think you've just heard in these very short testimonies a small sampling of variations of a common theme, and we're hearing this all over campus as you alum come together to celebrate what God has done in your life and through your ministries. And so that's why we're gathered here this morning. And we realize that there are many more who aren't with us and many more stories to be told. So as we go into this final full day, let's continue to walk in the light, to worship in the light, to rest in the light, and then to bear witness in the light. Thank you for coming out this morning. I think Mark is going to close us here before we leave, but let's give one more thank you to Bob and Noriko.